Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, really is a really nice anytime I get an invitation to talk through our work in the lens of elders, and when I hear people talk about their grandparents, um, for lots and lots of reasons, which if you followed me online, you probably know, but I'll talk a little bit about through the presentation. I don't have a lot of time, and for me to really tell you in depth about the role of this idea of elders and eldership in our work, I could go on for hours. So what I'm gonna, and also I think I take it from a very different angle than many people in this space. So I'm also okay if it like provokes you a little bit, and you want to like chat in the Q&A or push back or share. I'm really open to that. But I guess the place I want to start is that I grew up in an intergenerational household with my parents and my maternal grandparents. And my mother was raised by her maternal grandmother, and her grandmother lived in an intergenerational household with their maternal grandparents, right? So in Punjabi culture, we went the opposite way around to what normally happens. Normally, girls get married and then live with their husbands' families, and then the paternal grandparents become the arc of the story. But for lots and lots of different reasons, due to partition, due to all sorts of different things happening, the partition of India and a whole range of other things, I've came down this line of being raised in this like lineage of maternal grandparents. And then in the UK, again, that was quite unusual to be living in that structure. And I lived with them for nearly 30 years. They've passed away now. And so first and foremost, I just want to say that that's why our work is the way it is. It isn't because we professionalize the idea of eldership and ancestry into like a bunch of like professional words and topics and programs, and we forced it. It's because we built from the spirit of the lives we had lived. And it's interesting for me to talk about this now because I've just come off another call about a podcast I'm about to talk on called Corporate Bodies. And the podcast is all about this other piece of work that we've done, really about looking at the organizational structure in the Western world and how it's totally at odds with being able to build the relational long-term human scale relationships you need, and is full of like how you create legal relationships and organizational relationships to ideas that are that struggle to sit within that. And so I think Civic Square is a bit of a funny one because it's built in the spirit of something really deep and human. It's was co-founded and built over the last 15 years by people who found themselves together because our life experiences were fairly similar, largely from Black and brown communities in the UK, largely from big families who still lived together in those families, and we created our work in the image of those things. So if you're looking for a toolkit on eldership, there'll be plenty of places where you can find that kind of stuff, how to organize intergenerationally, how to do policy for future generations, how to think about bringing ancestors and ideas into the work. There's so many great practitioners and there's so many tools that I could share, but I'm just going to tell a bit of a story of our work. And I think you're going to be like probably quite surprised where I'll take it, but just stick with me and then let's towards the end have a bit of a discussion. And I hope it's useful. So and of course I don't have loads of time to tell you about everything, so I'm just going to jump through a couple of big ideas. Can you see the screen? Yeah, amazing. All right,
Yes,
thank you. So Civic Square was born out of a civic and community movement of young and young at heart people in the early 2010s who were super duper disgruntled with the systems and the occupations and the sectors within which they worked or they were expected to work, from architects to engineers to young people leaving school, college, university. And we originally built a TEDx event, which back in 2010, it wasn't a big commercial platform. It was just a space to get a license to bring people together. And we started to center voices that weren't centered in our city. Birmingham has a long history of a very centralized, very patriarchal, very white, very big city approach to governance. And it was and has been failing for a long time. The city's just declared bankruptcy. But at the same time, it was one of the youngest and most diverse cities in Europe by statistics. It has a centre for super diversity. I hate all these words, by the way, but I'm just telling you the words that how our city described itself when I was 23. And we were just like, wow, okay, this doesn't make any sense to us. It's falling apart. It's full of this incredible demographic dividend that finds itself here as a result of colonization. And nowhere, anywhere can we see anything that looks like us, represents us, is anything other than a very corporate, professional approach to organizing our institutions and society. And so we started from the point in which we had lived. Between 2010 and 2017, we started to organize events where we put our peers, our parents, our grandparents, their peers, all the people who didn't fit the mold of like who stands up on a TEDx stage, what sorts of ideas are up there. We rejected solutionism and looked at and went away from silos of innovation towards looking at systemic change, interdependent systems, indigenous histories, ancestry, our communities, our leaders who were not seen as leaders, but perhaps were running the corner shop. And we started to put their thoughts and ideas on the stages. And of course, and we put our food and we put our music and we brought out Birmingham. This was Birmingham. This wasn't all over the world. This was the generation that had come here because of colonization and we were born here. And what started to happen is this confidence grew. This beautiful confidence grew amongst this generation who, you know, that internal colonization, that idea of should these things even be here, this thing you'd been born in about what is good and proper and ideas and how does this work on like how are we meant to be when we step outside of our homes and join the professional sphere. This started to be just crushed. And probably many of you know globally and across many different contexts that strange corporate culture, even in the social sector, has been ripped open over the last 15 years since George Floyd's murder. That's been opened up again in the genocide in Gaza now. You know, the illusion of how we're supposed to organize is opening up. And so I've been part, and I wanted to share that context because I've been part of that generation. You know, I graduated at a time where there was a certain way that we were supposed to be, and all the ways that made me in the world of work, in the world of how we come together, and everything that made me me and my community me, and all the people around me, and all the resilience I saw in our communities who'd come here post-partition as a result of many different things, that you left at home, and then you got to work and you needed to be someone else. So the first thing over the last 15 years that we've been really at the foundation doing is building completely different spaces for these conversations and this work to happen. And I've got loads of opinions on that piece about, you know, is it just about adopting ideas? Is it about newness? Where do we find the space between that? But first and foremost, I wanted to say that the organizational structure and all the stuff you're about to hear about our work is just a vehicle in this current context in society to move us from a certain reality to other ones. I don't really like what this work has been born from is a deep spirit of bringing together communities in completely different ways. And so during that TEDx period, that community grew in confidence and grew in size and was gaining a lot of attention for its creativity and innovation and all of this. And I used to find it bizarre because I was like, I don't think it's any of those things. I literally just think we're trying to bring out all the things that we've been told to repress and hold back. And part of that for me is our elders, our communities, our stories, our ways of organizing that aren't necessarily deemed in this economy as valuable or important, or in current British society as the way that you lead or the ideas and stories you talk about. So we came together and we crowdfunded and we built a 10,000 square foot space called Impact Hub Birmingham. And through that, we then started to bring the stories of those communities. And I could show you hundreds of pictures, but I'm just leaving it on this one. But we brought thousands of people together over the 5 years, 6 years it was open. We did the largest crowdfunder in Birmingham. And through this space, what we started to do is create a space that was safe for people of all ages. We actually used then the design principles of 8 to 80. So I don't know if you've heard about 8 to 80 cities. It's based on this idea of if you design places for 8-year-olds and for 80-year-olds, if they're good for those two groups of people, the spaces are good for pretty much everyone. Beautiful, like architectural urban design movement. And so we were like, cool, let's do that. And so we had a creche, we had all sorts of things, from dinners to, we used to have things like parents' evening, because we used to say that all of the parents of people who worked at the hub never knew what they were doing. Like, you try and explain the job to your parents, because we're that generation of like doing multiple things, and it didn't identify as a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. So we used to have like parents and grandparents day. And what we started to do is just mess with this culture of what work is and what our spaces are for, what we use them. And we crammed out this space for 6 years. But the point of this space was to build this wider idea. And this is why I'm saying, like, all of this was like the spiritual and how we organized piece. This just came from our hearts and our souls. Our mission wasn't, how do we bring together elders and young people to solve our biggest social challenges? We've only put that back in our story now because we understand that this is something that is understood more widely. But our real work here was about, how do we connect people in their places to be at the forefront of tackling the biggest challenges we face. So we were getting to the root of our systematic challenges. And in the UK, things like land justice, climate justice, housing, these were like real things that were affecting people. And at the root of them was like deep injustice in the way we have our relationship with land, and so on and so on. And so for years, we were organizing around this. We were very young. We were moving from an energetic and inspired and thoughtful and creative convivial movement of people that had accidentally found itself in the limelight because it had attracted all this attention. And we were trying to learn, how do you actually move those sorts of communities into like organizing them towards social challenges. So that's what we did for 5 years. Cut a long story short, we had an incredible time until the day we closed, and we closed on purpose. Because the whole point of what happened in that space is, when you did bring people from so many different backgrounds, so many different histories, when you started to surface the stories of pre-colonization of our places, when you started to tap into the knowledge of elders, when younger people were in the space, when children were in the space, what you start to find is your gaze on how change needs to happen, and the root causes of some of the challenges completely changes. So what we realized over time, and just to give you one really practical example, we were in a rented building where a landlord in Saudi Arabia was extracting us of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds of rent a year. And every time we did better, they'd up the rents. And it was a really great like thing that was happening. I mean, it wasn't great that we lost like nearly £1 million to a foreign landlord, and we definitely were doing work that was dramatically improving so many different things. But it was useful for us to see this, because as a community then, as a much wider movement, we were starting to see, hold on, what does it mean to organize and get to the roots of some of these challenges. And so we closed because we wanted to go and find our own space and start to build something in the image of that. And that work continues all the way through our work now. I'm going to take a moment out to quickly whiz through a couple of key things in who we are and what we're doing now and how it shows up in our work, and then I'll stop for Q&A. So at the heart of our work is this question, is this deep idea that people in their places, we work at the home, street and neighborhood layer, people in their places should be at the forefront of designing, owning and governing the large scale of transitions we face. So all that work of the previous decade basically taught us, oh fuck, we are fucked, and nobody told us. Not properly. They didn't tell us properly. Nobody really told us about the climate and ecological emergency properly. Nobody really told us about the fossil fuel industry. Nobody really told us about land injustice. Our parents and our grandparents were telling us stories of overconsumption and their stories of displacement, but we hadn't the confidence that these things were linked. The reason why we were here were the same reasons why we as a society are here. And by 2019, this movement had grown great confidence, and we were like, how do we get to the forefront of actually stewarding a transition that is regenerative, just, and we start at the home, street and neighborhood layer. And so our work is organized into 3 primary demonstrators. The first is that we've got a large industrial site in the middle of inner city neighborhood called Ladywood, where we are transforming it and retrofitting it into a space that is stewarded by the people, that has the resources, infrastructure, spaces and tools for communities and neighborhoods to be at the forefront of the large scale of economic, social, ecological, climate transition that we need to go through. Secondly, at the heart of this, we're working on getting to the root of some of these deep challenges through the work in our second demonstrator, which is looking at reimagining economic possibility. How do we move an economic system to be in balance with people and planet, and not just in the current extractive norms and ideas it is in right now? And thirdly, we are focusing on what that looks like at a street level, which is looking at the deep retrofit, carbon, energy, ecological, wider transition at the scale of the street. Now, obviously, from what I've just talked about in the previous slide to now, we're now at a 16-year story, right? So I can't tell you of all the bits that we've moved down. But one of the things I really want to share is that actually that history that I talked about, and why I find it so enriching and beautiful to work at the neighborhood level, is because you don't have to worry about how do we get intergenerational movements together? How do we get elders and young people? And we're not designing projects to kind of force this. We are in the heart of where people live, and we are designing around the life that you can see and all the different people that are there. And so these 3 key demonstrators are in response to a big piece of work that we have shared called 3 Degree Neighbourhoods, which looks at the current risks that UK neighbourhoods face due to climate and ecological emergencies, and they are profound. And, you know, the conclusion of that work, which I won't have time to share, but I will share all these slides, which has some of that work at the end, is that we are going to need to fundamentally transform our relationship with one another, the land we live on, the resources we use, the materials we are working with, and the built environment is a really beautiful and thoughtful place to do that work, because it has such a substantial damage and impact on the one hand, but also it's where people feel most connected to their places and where we work very much in the everyday. And so our work looks a lot like this. One of the most important things is we have 3 layers of organizing. We talk about working at the layers of the dark, dream, and everyday matter. The dark matter is all those systems and ideas that I talked about that are under the surface. The land system, legislation, the goal of our economic system, all the things that are underneath the surface. You don't see it all the time, but it drives everything that we do. The dream matter, which is a space of activating the radical imagination, the ability to look hundreds of years in the future, look hundreds of years in the past, really built on 7th-generation Indigenous thinking about how we can radically imagine ourselves outside of the current systems, and the everyday matter, which is bringing it to life in the everyday. What it shows up like in our work is that different work can start from different ingredients. you will see deeply participatory work, and then huge research reports and all sorts that are in very, very different layers. But what we found in our work is when you stay in any one layer for too long, the movement becomes stagnant. When you talk about the dark matter for too long, people are like, okay, so you're telling me that until we change a 400-year land contract that is extractive and colonial, we can't do anything. What can we do now? If you stay in the dream matter too long, people are like, that's great. I love dreaming hundreds of years in the future. I love looking back hundreds of years. I love feeling that something else is possible, but how do we make it tangible now? When you're in the tangible now, what of course happens, and like I've seen in every amazing work and movement, is the confidence grows. And so then people are like, how do they get to the root of things? And they're like, the problem isn't us. There are fundamental systemic things that are at heart here. And then they get bored of just like the participatory work, and we're like, right, how do we organize, dismantle the system or burn down the system, or how do I incorporate? Like, one of the biggest things I always find, especially with young people in our work, is once they have unlocked a bunch of knowledge that was sat within them, you always hear this thing of like, oh, my grandparents talk about that loads. And then they're like, I'd really love to bring them in. So a lot of our work in the everyday that is not all the things you see online looks a lot like this. It is things like trade schools. It is things like unlocking the inherent wisdom of people in the neighborhood. It is about bringing them together over everyday entry point activities that are focused on, the natural world and on their neighborhoods. It's not bringing them together on anything super serious and stressful. It is about saying, hey, you have a skill to share, you have a wisdom. We set up a space, and every week we have this being shared. It means whether you know how to change a tap or make inks from natural dye, make inks from flowers or natural materials, or you know how to repair a tatty broken pair of jeans, or you know how to I don't know, make fresh pasta, whatever you know, we start from there. And so a big part of our team's work is this everyday work, which brings together people from where they are, and we use that as an entry point into the much bigger story. And so it's at all different levels, all different scales, all different types of skills and resources and knowledge that we are working on there. And it can look like activism sometimes as well. But just to finish, because I know I've gone over time and there's loads to share. Our work is about being able to build those intergenerational movements in our neighborhoods and build the infrastructure. So this is one of the mock-ups of the site that we're transforming. Build the infrastructure to make those, however you want to talk about it, intergenerational movements, 8 to 80 cities, make this a much more everyday thing to happen, and not something that is remarkable where young people are in one place and elders are in another place. And I'm sure many of you saw that famous example in Seattle many years ago, where the elder people's home and the nursery were put in the same building, and they visited each other and did stuff together, and everybody's outcomes like went up. And you know, I remember showing my grandmother that before she died, and she was like, wow. And then she was also like, I think this is just how life was as well. And so I think there's loads to talk about here, but we're really interested in, at a bigger scale, what it means to build the infrastructure to make those interactions, those movements, not only more everyday and more normal, but also I haven't gone into it, but really deeply to acknowledge that the future we're facing and future generations are facing is not even the one that many of us have experienced for the last 50 years or so. And so the ability for those movements and these spaces to be able to respond to crisis, respond to a changing climate, a changing world, to be able to transition, is going to be not just a nice thing, not just like it's nice to be with my elders, it's nice to create these spaces, but it's going to be critical to our collective thrivance. It's going to be critical to resilience. It's going to be critical for us to be able to meet the challenges of the coming years. So I've taken that a bit all over the place, a bit about our work, a bit about the history, a little bit about my own personal journey. You know, it's a long time of work, so I could definitely talk to you for hours, but I'm up for hearing some questions, and I'm going to share these slides into the channel so you can just get a little bit of a because there's like 50 slides that come after this. You can look at some of the images, have links to some of our work, and see what might interest you. But basically, our work started because a bunch of us lived with their grandparents and we decided to build a movement. We decided to do something with that, and then it turned into a space, and now it's turned into something much, much larger.